In this second video on the history of American education, we'll take the story from the end of the early national era in the early 1800s through the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, as the early national era ended, many of the new states established, quote, common schools, which operated at the basic elementary level. The local communities would levy a small tax to support the schools, but students were also charged tuition. The schools would be in one room with one teacher who would teach students of all ages. Still, for children in rural areas and along the ever-expanding frontier, schools of any kind remained relatively rare. Attendance wasn't compulsory, and many families chose not to have their children attend, usually because they needed the children's labor. At this time, men were the primary teachers in these common schools, but it wasn't considered a high-status job or did it pay well. Students would often use small individual slates for writing in chalk, but the teachers needed a way to present lessons to the whole class. In the early 1800s, a professor at the newly created United States Military Academy decided to import an idea first used in Scotland, a large modern blackboard mounted on a wall, and this idea quickly spread. With paper production increasing as the early national era ended, students needed a cheap writing utensil that would make the individual writing slate obsolete. In the 1820s, graphite was discovered in New England, but it was of inferior quality and smudged too much to be really good for writing. The famed writer and transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau's pencil factory had a solution, a graphite hardening technique that served as the precursor to the classroom staple today, the number 2 pencil. Not long thereafter, a Frenchman developed the first pencil sharpener, which spread to America. By the antebellum age, many common schools are already using paper and pencils for assignments. As the antebellum age dawned, a significant improvement in education came with the reforms of Horace Mann, who in 1837 became Secretary of Education in the state of Massachusetts. Mann had been impressed by the organization and professionalism of the Prussian education system in Europe and sought to adopt its reforms in his state. First, Mann sought to train teachers not only in their subject, but pedagogy. He helped establish what became the first, quote, normal schools, 2-year teachers' colleges. To fill these positions, he sought to encourage women to enter the profession in greater numbers. Today, women still comprise the majority of teachers, a characteristic that went back to Mann. Mann also sought to separate children by age, students progressing from one, quote, grade to another. In each grade, among all Massachusetts common schools, teachers would teach from a standard curriculum, usually adopting the lecture method employed in European universities. Mann encouraged both primary and secondary common schools, which would award a certificate upon completion. He also sought to make the primary level free. The standardization and advancement inherent in Mann's system here made some people refer to it as the, quote, factory model of education. At that time, the early Industrial Revolution and the first factories were beginning, with female labor and standardization the operating principle there too. Mann's reforms proved popular throughout the antebellum age, primarily in the northern states, and it quickly spread. Undoubtedly a byproduct of Mann's efforts, teachers sought to advance the interest of education on their own. Late in the antebellum age, education associations from 10 states formed the National Education Association, or the NEA, to, quote, unite to advance the dignity, respectability, and usefulness of their calling. Despite Mann's position, the NEA still refused membership to women until after the Civil War. As Mann's reforms were unfolding, a new textbook became popular throughout America, the Mcguffrey Readers. Like Webster's Blue Book Speller, which it replaced, the Mcguffrey Readers stressed civic duty and morality, and was also a bestseller, with tens of millions of copies used nationwide. In fact, throughout the 19th century, it was the second most popular book used after the Bible, and it was used well into the 20th century. The Mcguffrey Readers were written by the Scots-Irish Iowa teacher William Holmes Mcguffrey. Outside of Mann's reforms and the spread of the Mcguffrey Readers grew the idea of compulsory attendance. By the end of the antebellum age, many northern states had instituted compulsory education, at least at the primary level. The 1840 census, for example, tabulated that just over half school-age children between 5 and 15 attended formal schools. By 1910, the figure was approximately 3/4. The last state to require compulsory attendance was Mississippi during World War I. While these figures were in a sense impressive, and American literacy remained high among the world's children, the southern states still lagged. In rural parts of the South, schools rarely went beyond the primary level, which was later called, quote, 8th grade schools. Parents often still needed their children for labor, and qualified teachers were hard to get. Even primary schools still charged tuition. Many Southerners in the antebellum age saw their readers and textbooks, invariably published in the North, as northern threats to their way of life. Education for any free blacks in the South was exceptionally rare, and education for slaves, of course, remained illegal. Not surprisingly, therefore, literacy was much lower in the antebellum South than the antebellum North. Another aspect of regionality in education was the length of the school term. There was no summer break, but in rural areas, and thus more in the South, the school had short breaks in the spring for the planting season, and again in the fall for the harvest season. But in cities, and thus more in the North, students went to school virtually year-round with only holidays off. The Civil War wreaked havoc on American education, especially in the South as the war progressed. Teachers left for the military or other wartime functions, while at times teachers were dismissed for their contrarian loyalties. The Northern blockade of the South cut off teaching supplies and textbooks, and in response the Confederacy attempted to establish its own textbook publishing in Mobile, Alabama. By the end of the war, the need for manpower had even begun to drain students from Southern schools. In the North, tax revenues diminished and colleges shrank, if not actually closing their entire student body and faculty in wartime pursuits. With the South out of Congress, the Republican-dominated Congress was able to pass the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, which provided funds to create a series of agricultural and mechanical colleges in the states. The South had resisted the effort, fearing it would negatively impact the spread of slavery. Many states had an academic traditional university, but the idea here was a college to prepare students not just in academics, but in the more vocational areas that in demand, farming and manufacturing, both profoundly impacted by, of course, the growing industrialization. At the same time, the Northern victory during the American Civil War dramatically expanded education for the ex-slaves, the so-called freedmen. Much to the chagrin of the defeated Confederates, the U.S. government established the Freedmen's Bureau to provide economic relief. As part of this new effort, freedmen's schools were established to teach not only reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, but equally as important, the very concept of freedom. That no one could now tell the freedmen what to do, and that they had their rights of their own. After the war, during Reconstruction, President Andrew Johnson attempted to exert control nationally over rebuilding the school system. In 1867, he established the first Department of Education, a predecessor to the cabinet-level agency that still exists today. This, however, led to outrage, and not only in the South. People interpret the Constitution as giving the states the primary role in education. As a result, Johnson was forced to scale back his department into a smaller and weaker Office of Education. Nevertheless, with Northern Republicans in charge of rebuilding the South, the era of Reconstruction witnessed the Southern Republican-dominated governments institute the first Southern primary schools completely covered by tax dollars. The first secondary schools emerged in some cities, although private academies still flourished for those who could afford it. Of course, in the late 19th century, almost all schools, North and South, remained segregated. In fact, the codification of such, quote, Jim Crow laws by the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision of the Supreme Court in 1896 assured that segregated schools in the South would remain the rule until the middle of the 20th century. With the help of both an 1890 expansion of the Morrill Land Grant Act and philanthropists, the industrial age of the late 19th century saw a number of colleges established for African Americans, as well as an explosion in scholarships for them. Among these famous, quote, historically black colleges were Fisk University, Hampton Institute, Howard University, and Atlanta University, among others. While a handful of Northern African Americans have been admitted and graduated from the small number of liberal Northern colleges that then admitted them, this new trend towards black colleges dramatically expanded the number of educated African Americans. Within the academic community, however, African American leaders argued over how to address the racial disparities and continuing Jim Crow segregation. Arguing that African Americans comprised a small minority within a white-dominated society that believed them inferior, the educator Booker T. Washington maintained that African Americans needed to educate themselves in the types of jobs then available to them, the industrial jobs. Protesting for better education opportunities immediately would only harden their racism and make advancement more difficult, Washington argued. Industrial education, by contrast, would demonstrate that African Americans were in fact equal and thus, over time, diminish their racism and make further advances possible. W.B. Du Bois, however, another African American leader, disagreed. Asking Washington about the, quote, talented tenth, that small number of African Americans who already had a broader education, Du Bois demanded equality immediately. African Americans should reject Washington's so-called Atlanta Compromise, and they should demand the same education, same opportunities as the whites now, and they should protest if they were denied them. Because Washington's philosophy appealed more to the white-dominated society, African American schools were often named for him, while Du Bois was considered too radical. Meanwhile, during the late 19th century, the tremendous immigration and urbanization helped strain the educational system. Schools were often crowded and hot during the summer, which contributed to many states to adopt the idea of a long summer vacation, a system that still allowed rural children to help in the fields and wealthy children to go on vacations or travel with their parents. This system, of course, still dominates today. Public school systems continued to adapt, many adopting the, quote, 6-3-3 system, a standard progression from 6 years of elementary school, as they called it, to 3 years of so-called junior high school, to finally 3 years of so-called high school, at which point students would be considered to have graduated and completed their studies. The explosive growth in America brought the number of students from 200,000 in 1890 to about 1 million only 20 years later, and then to almost 2 million only 10 years after that. While less than 10% went to the new high schools in 1890, almost a third did by World War I. The graduates found jobs especially in the rapidly growing white-collar sector of the new industrial corporations, exactly the type of jobs that Du Bois demanded for African Americans. Large cities and small cities across the country rushed to build new high schools. Despite all the advances in education during the industrial age of the late 19th century, college remained only for a small minority of Americans. By the end of the 19th century, only approximately 1,000 colleges existed in the United States, educating just 160,000 students. With the help of some of the rich industrialists, however, the number of universities soon exploded, and those who already existed witnessed their endowments expand. Schools like Vanderbilt University, Duke University, Johns Hopkins University, Stanford University, Carnegie Mellon University, and the University of Chicago quickly grew among the best universities in the world. Colleges began expanding their degree programs, offering more graduate degrees, such as a doctorate, which before had been largely been confined just to European universities. New fields of study and new academic disciplines emerged. Colleges began requiring applicants to take standardized tests as part of the admissions process. College entrance exams were first proposed in 1890, but in 1900 the College Entrance Examination Board was established to make it official. By the early 20th century, the progressive era sought to address some of the problems that grew from the industrial age, and education was no exception. With optimistic reformers relying on expertise, government at all levels once again began to evolve how it approached teaching the young. With the number of students in schools exploding, localities began to form what they called school districts, complete with a centralized administration and equitable budget between schools. While the idea of normal schools had existed back to Man's day in the antebellum age, the number and quality of such teacher colleges exploded during the progressive age. Some states had first tried to certify teachers in the late 19th century, but these certification efforts and testing became much more elaborate and widespread during the progressive age. School districts and states wanted to assure that the teachers they hired were quality instructors. Not surprisingly given this, teachers organized a new union to advocate for their own salaries and working conditions. In 1916, the American Federation of Teachers, or the AFT, was a union that was formed to help teachers, and it joined a larger industrial union, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. The AFT rivaled the earlier NEA I'd mentioned in that they both claimed to protect academic freedom and the profession at large, but the new American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, was clearly more in the vein of a traditional activist labor union, engaged more in such things as collective bargaining. While the earliest coordinated efforts to track student progress began in the late 1830s, the widespread use of standardized student tests first emerged during the Progressive Age. Between 1900 and 1932, 1,300 achievement tests hit the market, as well as nearly 100 vocational tests, high school tests, and standardized measurements of athletic ability. With greater emphasis on the total person, schools began offering physical education, and the growth in competition in several sports between high schools began to mirror that which existed between colleges. With experts arguing that even young children could learn before the age of about 6, when the first grade began, and many immigrant children in poor tenement house conditions near the factories, many states decided to adopt the idea of, quote, kindergarten, a concept of preschool that had been practiced with much success in Germany. It would, as experts explained, lay an earlier foundation for academic success in schools. At the other end of the educational spectrum, new accreditation agencies grew for colleges and universities, accepted by the colleges as a way to distinguish themselves from many schools that use the term college or university, but lacked any sense of being such, that lacked the same quality or just outright scams. Realizing that despite the growth in colleges, most students would still not advance to that level, many school districts adopted a curriculum that offered more vocational opportunities, training in such things as woodwork, bookkeeping, or, for girls, home economics. Many school districts offered distinctive tracks of study for different types of students. Other school districts adopted their curriculum to the workplace needs of their specific community. Rarely did school districts still offer the classical education, subjects such as Latin, Greek, or philosophy. Application to the real world was seen as key. With increasing exposure to the world, foreign languages became common in many high schools. A major progressive educational reform was advocated by John Dewey. The educational system, he argued, needed to prepare students to think and not just know, to utilize and apply knowledge in the real world, and to uncover new knowledge, not just recite lessons from the past. As such, Dewey emphasized experimental education, hands-on experiments where the student could learn from doing, not just rote study. It would spark curiosity and intellectual growth, he said, that would advance society's interest. Much to Dewey's chagrin, however, his laboratory schools challenged the educational bureaucracies that were growing at the same time. Some more progressive school districts adopted his methods, but many didn't. Regardless, later in the 20th century, his concepts became popular and remain so today. As the idea of education expanded during the Progressive Age, new, quote, junior colleges, later termed community colleges, emerged, offering 2-year degrees aimed at working adults and focused more on vocational skills practical in the modern industrial age. With local and state governments still controlling primary and secondary education, it was natural that different curricula developed. By the early 20th century, many southern school districts were teaching the so-called lost cause mythology. Their schools taught that the antebellum Southern society was noble and genteel, and that slavery was largely paternalistic, not harsh, with the treatment of slaves even better than factory laborers in the antebellum North. The South, they taught, had launched the Civil War to protect states' rights, not to defend slavery. This, of course, was not what was taught in Northern curricula, nor was it true. The war students were taught there in the North was fought because of slavery, which was an affront to American ideals, a civilized society, and religious morality. The advancement of science during the early 20th century also led to controversies over curricula. By this point, the scientific evidence of natural selection and evolution, first outlined by Charles Darwin decades earlier, had become so overwhelming that it was taught in schools. In many southern states, however, Christian fundamentalists sought to defend the idea of creationism found in the biblical book of Genesis by outlawing the teaching of evolution. This, in 1925, led to the famous Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee. The trial, which riveted the nation on radio, found the teacher of evolution, John Scopes, guilty of violating the state law. The trial evidence ended up so discrediting the creationist argument in the public square, however, that laws prohibiting the teaching of evolution soon faded nevertheless. Throughout the 1930s, the Great Depression profoundly impacted American education. With millions of Americans out of work, property tax payments, and therefore school budgets, plummeted. Schools fell into disrepair or were closed. Teachers were fired or had their salaries reduced. And the children who did attend were often hungry or traumatized by difficult home lives. With many Americans on the road looking for work, a generation of school children became transients. Because many young people were dropping out of school to try to help their families, the federal government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal created the National Youth Administration, the NYA, which offered part-time work, allowing the students to remain in school during the Great Depression. This concludes the second video on the history of American education, going from the end of the early national era in the early 1800s through the Great Depression of the 1930s.